Yes, I'm interested in understanding how what we call urban form affects travel behavior. So by urban form, I mean all sorts of characteristics of the built environment you live in, the density, the amount of jobs relative to residents, the quantity of roads, and all of those characteristics. And we're interested in how this is going to affect the way you travel and how many miles you actually do and how many miles you do, especially by car. Why are we concerned by that? Because there are some social costs associated with using personal transportation. So we know for each mile that we drive, society incurs a cost of 3 or 4 cents, maybe slightly more, associated with two different forms of pollution. One is greenhouse gas emissions, i.e. carbon, that fosters climate change, global warming, and all of that. And the second one is much more localized, small particulates, which typically give asthma to babies and old people, and from time to time they die. So what we found is that urban density measured by summing the quantity of jobs and residents in whatever 5 miles around where you live or 3 miles around where you live reduces higher urban well density, reduces your travel. So the elasticity is typically a 10% higher well density leads to reduction in traveling of about 1%. So the conclusions that surprised us most is the fact that actually we were expecting the situation and the results to be fairly complicated and fairly subtle. What we discovered is actually reality was for once very simple, in the sense that there's actually one major characteristic of cities that matters, and the environment where we live that matters, that's the density well around you. Everything else is really well secondary and matters far less. And what we also found is that those results were extremely robust. We were also expecting like different groups of residents to react differently depending on where they live, because we were also expecting people who like driving to live in places where it's easier to drive, and this to be really important in the results. Actually not at all. Everybody seems to be reacting more or less in the same way, or at least we could not find very much of a difference across different groups, across different types of environments. So basically, again, if you bring up well density by about 10%, you reduce driving by about 1%. Even though we do find some effects, but this 10% higher density leading to 1% less driving is actually a very small effect. So if you want to see what it means or to understand what it means in reality, if you were to take the 30 million Americans that live at the lowest well density in rural areas and bring them to nearly the highest well density in the country, that's a scale of that's a displacement with the scale of Syria at the moment. So it's massive. It's not something that's going to happen at all, but that would lead to a reduction in driving by whatever 4 or 5%. Even something that is still extremely drastic, but slightly less so. So taking, again, 30 million more Americans from low-density areas, but instead of shutting them down, will completely bring them to high-density areas, but leaving some people in those low-density areas, the effect on aggregate rail driving would be minimal. Because those that are brought to high-density areas will drive less, but those that actually are left in the low-density areas will drive lots more, and it's nearly a perfect offset. So as a result, you won't be able to achieve very much in terms of global warming using urban policies of that sort. What you need to use are to go after pollution. You need, after local pollution, you need to tax congestion, i.e. the concentration. With the concentration of cars in some areas of cities, so you need to make them pay for that. And you need to tax carbon emissions, like for instance the province of British Columbia does in Canada. It's a resounding success. So I know it's politically a really hard proposition in this country, but that's the one thing that works. Everything else will not do very much. So we have this perception that because indeed the federal government in this country is not very effective at doing very many things, that a lot of the solutions have to be local, and you have whatever Myers for America, and all the solutions have to be coming from city halls and from willing Myers to some extent. But global problems, they require global solutions, they require federal interventions. We're not going to solve global warming by having cities practicing smart growth. That will only achieve very, very little, and some of it, like imposing green belts, if anything, might be just counterproductive. So what sets us apart? Well, it's an area where there's been a lot of research. So what is setting us apart is, first, we use extensive data for travel. Instead of looking at a tiny area and a number of cars, we actually rely on a big survey done by the Department of Transportation with nearly 1 million trips. So that's a very large-scale survey. Then we use extensive measures of the local environments where people reside. So what we've done was actually use satellite imagery and grid everything on a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer basis, both a description of the physical environment, but also using a vast array of data coming from the census, coming from employment, and so on and so forth, and grading all that to know exactly what there is around where people live in terms of number of jobs, of number of residents, how rich those residents are, how educated they are, and this and that. So we use vastly more data also to describe the environment. And the last thing we did, it's not because you observe a negative correlation between how dense an area is and how little people drive, that this relationship is causal. This relationship may just be completely spurious because, again, people that like to drive may want to live in low-density environments. So what we've done was to design a new methodology to address that question, looking at the fact that people, when in some cases, they moved somewhere, circa 2000. They moved to neighborhoods that were very highly comparable in terms of all characteristics. But some of those neighborhoods between 2000 and 2010 got a lot more population. And not everybody moved out or moved in. So we look at people, how they responded to differences in the amount of population that they got for those that have stayed for a long time. So that allows us to go, sorry to be technical here, but that allows us to go through this selection problem and actually make some causal statements where we can actually claim that the local environment has an effect on the amount of driving that you do, but this effect, again, is small. So what's next is I want to think more about congestion, because we think of congestion as a big problem. It's true that traffic jams are for everyone to see. They're everywhere, particularly in developing countries where people keep buying cars with economic growth, and the situation gets worse. At the same time, we have no serious idea about the economic cost of that congestion. And for that, I want to be able to use new data that's now made available through mapping services like Google Maps, where you can actually get some travel times from anywhere to anywhere else in real time, knowing about the number of travelers, so you can actually estimate what the true cost of congestion. The other thing I want to look at more is urban land use, because we tend to think about land use as a use, so it's something that could be one use one day, maybe another use another day. The reality is, when we build stuff, it's for a very, very long time, and very often that stuff is very well tightly wedded to the needs of a particular user or set of users. So when we think about land use, we can see land use moving from agriculture to residential, and this is for everyone to see. But what's happening to all manufacturing? It's usually not places we go to. So some of it gets reconverted whenever it's really, really central, very valuable land. But there's a lot of suburban land in declining cities. It looks like nothing is happening. So we'd like to be able to know actually how much changes there is in land use over time among the more residential / manufacturing / different types of development. And we would also like to know if things revert back to nature from time to time. Our perception is not, but again, this is something that we don't know.